it is immoral for oil and gas companies to be making record profits from this energy crisis on the back of the poorest people and communities. The combined profits of the largest energy companies in the first quarter of this year are close to $100 billion. I urge all governments to tax these excessive profits and use the funds to support the most vulnerable people through these difficult times.
Today, in the world that we live in, most of us have unfortunately become too overly dependent on the state for our everyday necessities and well-being and way of life, where they are now taking advantage of our vulnerabilities. If we live in a contemporary society, we need energy to keep us warm and for our gas and electricity. We need fuel so our vehicles can get from A to B. And we all definitely need food, for without it, we would not last very long. And we need finances to pay for all of these things, for we cannot function at all without money. A study from Goldman Sachs observed that we are all globally entering a food, fuel, and cost of living crisis. But this has been a long time coming. Throughout human history, many nations of different hues have attempted to create a one world government within their empires. And this can only be successful with the expansion of more and more land, and each succeeding empire's land space gets wider. The Mongolian leader Genghis Khan had the largest empire covering a land mass that stretched from Asia into Europe. And like his predecessors and successors, many who have a geopolitical worldview have clearly understood that the more land and territory you acquire and the resources that grow on it, the more control you will have over the civilian population that you govern.
No doubt there's a homeless problem.
More homeless than ever before.
The homeless are just laying in the sidewalks everywhere.
That presents a problem for both government and business.
Oil is being sold to the global elite.
It's a struggle for land, language, and culture, forcibly taken from them by the United States of America.
Facebook's Mark Zuckerberg over his purchase of a huge property on the island of Kauai. Zuckerberg is locked in a legal battle over land that is part of his sprawling estate. Some Hawaiians say they have a legal and moral claim to that land. They trace their ancestry and connection to the place back generations.
The middle class was once a symbol of the American dream. So, what exactly happened to the American middle class?
Tricon is trying to buy 800 houses a month, and there are companies even bigger. Invitation Homes owns more than 80,000 rental houses. American Homes for Rent close to 60,000. Some of the all-stars of finance, Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, Blackstone, have put hundreds of millions of dollars into these companies.
January, 33% of all homes purchased in the U.S. were bought by investors, often Wall Street-backed companies with multi-billion-dollar funds.
Home prices in the large urban metropolitan areas were so expensive that people started moving out. And then you see these wildfires, and they're not going away.
With high inflation and increased demand, analysts we spoke to say, unfortunately, we can only expect rents to rise even more.
$16.15 trillion. That is how much debt American households owed by the second quarter of 2022. A staggering 41.79% increase from $11.39 trillion just 10 years prior.
Bill Gates owns more land than all of the entire city of New York. Jeff Bezos' land is double the amount, clocking in at 420,000 acres. John Malone, the largest private landowner in America, owns 2.2 million acres all by himself, a landmass slightly smaller than the island of Puerto Rico. America is enormous, yet 100 of the richest and largest private landowners in America own 1.86% of all the land available in the United States, the majority of their land being forests, ranches, and farmland.
An uncommon sight in the city of Buenos Aires. Tractors from across the country came to Argentina's capital to protest against the government of Alberto Fernández.
Maasai herders scatter as soldiers open fire in Loliondo. It's on the outskirts of the Serengeti National Park, a UNESCO World Heritage Site. They'd been demonstrating against a government exercise to mark off ancestral grazing lands to create a private hunting reserve.
Financial stress drives about 10,000 Indians in agriculture to take their own lives each year.
खेत में सिंजेंटा के या मोंसेंटो के बीज इस्तेमाल करता है कंपनियों का ही साम्राज्यवादी कंपनियों के पेस्टिसाइड इस्तेमाल करता है
Netherlands is the second largest agricultural exporter in the world after the United States.
I don't think I have a future in farming because we have to reduce our cattle by 70%. With only 80 cows, this won't be profitable, so we will have to close.
Investors are anxious to snap up world-famous Canadian farmland and rent it back to our farmers at exorbitant prices. They're getting help from this Liberal government. The new tax changes will apply a 45% dividend tax on sale of farmland from father to son and zero tax on the sale to a foreign-owned conglomerate. Why is this government helping foreign businesses turn our farmers into tenants of foreign landlords?
Honourable Minister of Finance.
Whether you are aware of it or not, farming is the world's oldest profession, going back to the beginning of human civilization, according to Forbes. And recent studies have shown that roughly 80% of what we put into our mouths to eat each day comes from the 608 million farms in the world. But this industry, as has been shown, is under major threat, as this vast monopoly of agribusiness wants to be hijacked by the elite, and whole businesses are suffering. But who actually profits? Bill Gates is the biggest private owner of farmland in the United States, and it is his farms that is supplying the French fries, carrots and onions to McDonald's, where people are eating the genetically modified food of Monsanto. Other industries are also under threat, where livelihoods that have existed for generations are losing out because of the economic interests of a few. And it's affecting every aspect of human life. In the UK, startup companies are struggling to get funding, and with the higher costs of living, UK landlords are putting up the rent to cover their costs, and the young people are moving back home to avoid being in debt. Even the over 50s are moving back in with their parents. There are many who think that they are not affected, but these issues affect every aspect of our lives. Do you want to know why? The late Avram Manhattan said that a moral problem, which by its very nature is an ethical one, and since the ethics of the individual affect the society of which he is a member, social problems are the responsibility of society. But since society is controlled by a government, and a government is made or unmade by political factors, political problems affecting other related problems in practically all strata of society at a national and international level, we are all affected. We are living in a world where even a Christian Palestinian journalist, when highlighting the injustices and human rights abuses in her homeland, is killed. And even in death, she cannot even have a peaceful burial, for her work still poses a threat. And all over the world, the nations are angry and frustrated, for all the governments seem to be following the same script, where they are economically crippling the civilian population and weakening them through economic warfare. And as heads of state are beginning to click that people are mad, they have decided to offer a scapegoat to blame for the modern economic woes.
It looks so mundane, and yet it is so important. This is the Nord Stream pipeline, which has long brought gas from Russia to Europe. It's a mainstay for untold millions of people. And now it sits idle, switched off by its operator, Gazprom, Russia's biggest company, controlled by the Kremlin. It's an act of economic aggression that could be as consequential as it was inevitable.
Vladimir Putin's Russia is being blamed for our current economic woes, and we are being led to believe that prior to the conflict in the Ukraine, when the whole world was on lockdown for over a year that increased more and more world poverty, we were an economically secure global village. From the beginning of the 20th century, Russia has always been a target from the West. And if you managed to be fed on Reaganite entertainment in the 1980s, anti-Russian euphoria dominated a huge chunk of the entertainment world. But why are we being trained and brainwashed into hating Russia? There is a reason for it. In a book titled Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution, published in 1974, the late British-American author Anthony Cyril Sutton said that Russia was then, talking about the start of the Russian Revolution in 1917, and is today the largest untapped market in the world. Moreover, Russia, then and now, constituted the greatest potential competitive threat to American industrial and financial supremacy. A glance at a world map is sufficient to spotlight the geographical differences between the vast and, look at the words highlighted, land mass of Russia and the smaller United States. Wall Street must have cold shivers when it visualizes Russia as a second super American industrial giant. In the book The Grand Chessboard, published in 1997, the Polish-American geopolitician Zbigniew Brzezinski also confirmed this and also said that although distant, the United States, with its stake in the maintenance of, and look at the words highlighted, geopolitical pluralism in post-Soviet Eurasia, clearly interested not only in developing the regions and highlighted is resources, but also in preventing Russia from exclusively dominating the regions, and look at the word highlighted, geopolitical space. Now, in 2015, as documented in the London Guardian, NATO said Russia's expansionism poses a potential threat. Just read the newspapers very closely. Every inch of territory, Russian land ringed by NATO, is tangled in Ukraine war. And you will observe that throughout the span of human history, man just does not change. To expand his territory, he wants to control the land and the things that either grow on the land or the resources that are buried within the earth. And as Europe, who has taken their instructions from the United States, refuses to lift sanctions, Russia made it very clear, you will suffer because I have the upper hand during the winter. Now, if you carefully study history, we can follow the geopolitical trend. The late Albert Tennick Olmsted, the American historian, is probably the best authority on Medo-Persia in his book History of the Persian Empire, when he recalls what has been labeled as one of the first great world empires. Medo-Persia, geographically situated in modern Iran in Western Asia, expanded their empire. They weren't as brutal as modern-day systems, even though there are apparent records of human rights abuses in that system. Most of the art is dominated by men who ruled for almost 200 years before it was overthrown by Greece. Now, how vast was this empire? As it was based in the East, in the book of Daniel, chapter 8, verses 4 and 20, it expanded westward into Europe, northward into Asia, and southward into Africa. And the book of Esther, chapter 1, verses 1 to 3, tells us that the Medo-Persian Empire stretched from India into Africa, at that time called Kush or Ethiopia by the Greeks. So man has not changed at all concerning geopolitics. And in this dire economic crisis, the narrator will show one final example of how you can control a whole nation by colonizing their land and their resources.
Activity is high as foreign nationals continue to be evacuated from all over Nigeria.
Gentlemen, we're gonna have to put you back in. Your prime objective is to extract Dr. Lena Kendricks. Our presence underground will be considered hostile.
My name is Lieutenant Waters. I'm with the U.S. Navy. I'm here to get you and your people out.
Hollywood and its deep-rooted, unchanging colonial bias narrative has for over a century planted a seed in the thoughts of its viewers throughout most of its history that anyone outside of the so-called civilized Western orbit are either savages or terrorists, and only the Western hero can save the world. The Pentagon-backed film Tears of the Sun, a false narrative about US Navy SEALs protecting civilians from brutal militia groups in Nigeria in West Africa, where peace comes through force and bloodshed, is nothing more than US imperialism cleverly disguised as spreading democracy. But we are not given the true and full picture. WikiLeaks in 2010 published cables that it is the Anglo-Dutch Shell Oil Company who has a total grip on the Nigerian state, from its land to its natural resources. Amnesty International documented that Shell is complicit in murder, rape and torture, and she is behind the brutal human rights abuses to those who stand up to her oil wealth, where Shell pays the Nigerian military to be brutal to its own people, whose livelihoods are ruined by this multinational energy company. And more documents are emerging that it is Shell who is behind the abuses in that country. In an article in the London Guardian that documented that Shell is fueling the violence in Nigeria by paying rival militant gangs, it documented that testimony from Shell's own managers also alleges that government forces hired by Shell perpetrated atrocities against local civilians, including unlawful killings and systematic torture. According to their own official website, Shell has been active in Nigeria since 1937. And even when people want to erase the Biafra War from Nigeria's history, very few want to admit who stoked the ethnic divide in that African state. As more intense studies are being released, it is becoming ever so clear that the Biafra Civil War was all about British oil interests. And when people say Nigeria is deeply corrupt, maybe it is, but there is a root cause behind it. And very few people carefully assess that when a corporation can single-handedly control a state and its resources where only the elite benefit, what effect will it have on the civilians? Let us take a brief look at Nigerian history before European colonization. As 90% of African culture is lying in the basement and in exhibitions of Western museums, and in people's private collections, which they are now reluctantly returning to Nigeria after outside pressure after 2 centuries. Very few are aware that it once had powerful kingdoms with highly sophisticated artwork from the Nok, Ife and Benin cultures. In the British Museum, you have lying in the lowest floor brilliantly carved metallurgy that are designed with such advanced precision from Igbo Oku that Western scholars are so shocked at their fine detail that it is still difficult for them to stomach how such sophistication can be accomplished from people who they still view as uncivilized. The late English archaeologist Charles Thurston Shaw, whose books are either very expensive or difficult to acquire, I wonder why, documented that they were a very highly sophisticated culture with a brilliant skill in bending metals. The Igbo of Nigeria and ex-slave Olaudah Equiano, the Benin historian Jacob Ekherviba, the Afro-Guyanese historian Walter Rodney, and the Black American historian George Washington Williams all documented that the Benin culture in Nigeria was a highly sophisticated kingdom. It had street lamps in the 15th and 16th century, highly sophisticated running streets and a drainage system for the water, and a modern-day mathematician said its city had a very highly sophisticated form of artwork on and inside of its buildings, and it had a huge wall to protect the kingdom that the 1974 Guinness Book of Records documented that it had more brickwork than the Great Pyramid of Egypt and the Great Wall of China. This may be hard for many to swallow, but the London Guardian published a very rare but brilliant document on Benin dated Friday the 18th of March 2016. And this journal confirmed that the Guinness Book of Records 1974 edition described the walls of Benin City and its surrounding kingdoms as the world's largest earthworks carried out prior to the mechanical era. According to the estimates by the new scientist Fred Pearce, Benin City's walls were at one point 4 times larger than the Great Wall of China and consumed 100 times more material than the Great Pyramid of Cheops, perhaps the largest single archaeological phenomenon on the planet. The Portuguese in 1485 acknowledged Benin City as one of the most beautiful and best planned cities in the world, run by a centralized and highly sophisticated bureaucracy. Benin City was also one of the first cities to have a semblance of street lighting. Huge metal lamps, many feet high, were built and placed around the city, especially near the king's palace. These main streets, which ran at right angles to each other, had underground drainage made of sunken impluvium with an outlet to carry away storm water. Barely any traces of these walls exist today. In 1897, the city was destroyed by British soldiers, looted, blown up and burnt to the ground. If you wish to get a glimpse into the glorious past of the ancient Benin Kingdom and a better understanding of this groundbreaking city, you are better off visiting the Benin Bronze Sculpture section of the British Museum in central London. So this highly sophisticated art is the only evidence left of the Benin culture before it was totally destroyed by the British. And as you carefully look at these artifacts, there is no visual evidence of blacks enslaving each other, especially when the Europeans came. They traded with the Portuguese, who documented that it was crime-free. It was only centuries later, when the very brutal Dahomey Amazon female warriors of Benin, Nigeria, that Hollywood is now trying to lionize, terrorize neighboring tribes, killed them, and sold their own race to the European slavers. This is documented by Cudjoe Lewis, the last survivor of the Middle Passage, who documented in the book Barracoon that the Dahomey female warriors massacred his village and sold the remaining people to slave traders. Now, men like Bishop James Johnson, a Yoruba Anglican priest, and Dr. Harold Moody, the Jamaican-born doctor and civil rights activist, both documented that it was Western missionaries, though they both were Christians, that opened the door for the exploitation of African mineral wealth by Western corporations. And a number of years ago, the narrator filmed a number of demonstrators in London's Trafalgar Square, where you can see that they are still feeling the effects for over a century of Britain's colonial divide and rule that weakens tribes within a state. But there is a reason that was done. In the 19th century, Nigeria was the world's leading producer of palm oil that was used for many different products in the Western world. This can be traced to what is known as the Berlin West Africa Conference of 1884-5 in Berlin, Germany, in the palace of Bismarck, the then German Chancellor. And what was the aim of this conference? For it will make you understand Shell's role in Nigeria. In a book titled The Dual Mandate in Tropical Africa, the Governor General of Nigeria said that the partition of Africa was, as we all recognize, due primarily to the economic necessity of increasing the supplies of raw materials and food to meet the needs of the industrial nations of Europe. So this man confirms that Africa's resources are primarily exploited to feed the nations of Europe. And his wife on the right, Dame Flora Louise Shaw, called that country Nigeria, from the Latin word Niger, that means black. So even though many have won and fought court battles against Shell, the devastation it has caused will probably take years to amend. And despite all these cases, the head of Shell brags how much revenue they are making while the rest of the world struggles to survive.
Runaway inflation, hundreds of thousands of jobs lost, and a sharp increase in the cost of living have brought thousands of South Africans onto the streets.
In recent decades, Ireland has become one of the most expensive countries in Europe. Recent increases in fuel, food, rent and energy has left many workers with little disposable income. On Saturday, people took to the streets in Dublin to express their anger, including pensioners who are really feeling the squeeze.
We have a levy on our pensions to make up for the money that was stolen out of our pensions by the government. What is happening now is we're suffering state-sponsored elder financial abuse.
All professions are affected by the rising cost of living.
Protesters throw rocks and sticks at police, authorities shooting tear gas into crowds as they march towards the Legislative Palace in Lima. The growing tension as President Pedro Castillo imposed a curfew Tuesday to quell recent anti-government protests over rising gas and food prices.
Imagine if your bank accounts were frozen without warning. Or you've been paying for an apartment that hasn't been built. That's happening in China, where economic woes have pushed people to the streets. And some people online, like homeowners who are threatening to stop paying their mortgages until developers clear construction delays and hand over the homes they bought.
In China, thousands are unable to access their savings at the rural banks because their accounts are frozen. The Bank of America has also frozen many of their customers' accounts. Canadian truckers temporarily have their accounts frozen. In the UK, anyone connected to a Russian oligarch have had their accounts frozen also. And all over the UK, people's accounts are mysteriously being frozen. And something very sinister is taking place, especially when banks in the UK are telling people they may limit what they can take out. People who have Lebanese-British dual citizenship are having their bank account shut down in Lebanon if they don't comply with certain rules. In Egypt, people are being limited more and more with what they can withdraw. And the Afghan central bank's assets of billions are being frozen by the United States government that has greatly increased the poverty all over that state. That is totally evil. But where is this all leading to? Even at the doors has a number of times showed that the globalists want to have absolute control over every aspect of people's lives all over the world. But humble students of prophecy know exactly where this is going. One day, an economic weapon will be imposed on all of the earth. And it doesn't matter what your sexual orientation is, what your ethnic group is, what your social status or religious or political affiliation is. Everyone on earth will be tested. And only those who have a deep love for their fellow man will warn them of what is to come. For they are slowly and psychologically training people of how the deep state and its military can invade anyone who steps outside of the New World Order paradigm, and very few will be prepared for what's to come.
Technology will help us do incredible things, but nothing can do what a soldier can do.
U.S. Army's new goggles can help soldiers see right through the walls of combat vehicles, which means infantry troops will have unparalleled situational awareness.
We got an exclusive look at one of the military's latest investments. It's a futuristic combat goggles that give soldiers a brand new way to see the battlefield. Not only can soldiers see in the dark, but they can see now through smoke and even peek around corners.
Back, and there's a new piece of police equipment that is stirring up quite a controversy. It's a radar device that reportedly allows officers and the FBI and U.S. Marshals to see through the walls to see if anybody is inside the home without getting a warrant.
See without being seen, even from a distance of more than 300 feet. This detection system is revolutionary, the only one in the world able to see through a wall at this distance. This detector understands how far from the wall people are standing, their position, and therefore the way in which the security forces can operate.
The most important feature here is the simplicity. You turn it on and it's operational immediately. You can place it against the wall and you'll know what's going on the other side.
These devices are already operational in about 50 countries around the world, already used in the field during sensitive missions by prestigious army and police units in Israel, England, or the United States.
So this isn't even at the doors update of where we are in time, so that people can clearly see where the movements of this earth are heading to. And they'll be following, if life is spared, a few more short studies to give people an insight of how things are intensifying. So, stay tuned.